Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at day number 4 from the 2020 U.S. Chess Championships, the final 2 rounds in the tournament, unless there is a tie. Now we're going to be looking at a game from round number 11. White's going to be played by Alejandro Ramirez. Black's going to be played by Jeffery Xiong. The reason we're going over this game is Jeffery sits 1 point behind Wesley So for first place. Jeffery can tie Wesley So. Wesley So is actually playing Nakamura in the 11th round. So Jeffery needs to win. Wesley So does need to lose, and then we would have a tiebreaker. And anytime, especially in a championship series, a teenager does extremely well from the United States. Definitely want to cover that as much as possible. And Jeffery's doing exactly that. So I thought we'd see how he ends this. And then if there is a tiebreaker, I'll get into that at the end of the video. But Alejandro starts out with the move e4, and Jeffery responds with the Sicilian c5. White continues with knight to f3, d6, and then c3. Not a very common move from White, attacking the Sicilian defense. d4, pretty much the most common play that you'll see. You could also, if White's being adventurous, play bishop to b5, but maybe Alejandro said, hey, I'm playing against someone opposite me on the virtual felt here, and I want to get pretty creative. Play c3. Then we have knight to f6, queen to c2, defending the pawn here on e4, queen to c7, g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop here to g2, pawn b6, and then bishop to g2. Now, I study a lot of chess openings. It's what I really enjoy about chess, and see how different players approach different openings, see the variations, and just kind of how they come up with new novel ideas. This is not an approach in the Sicilian defense that I see all that often. Don't know if I've ever seen this specific setup in the Sicilian. So very interested to see how these opponents attack this. First, we see bishop to b7, so both of the players eyeing down on these light squares. You can see this pawn here on e4 starting to stand out is a square that both sides may want to attack or defend. The bishop here on b7, attacking, as well as the knight here on f6. White immediately comes up and plays d3 to defend this, and Jeffery comes down to c4 and attacks the pawn here. Now, there is an exchange that does open up for the queen to defend this, but you can see now that the queen comes down, there's a queen, bishop, and knight all attacking this pawn here on e4. Now, my assumption is that Alejandro played this opening because the move knight to d2 is pretty tricky, and if black's not prepared for this, can fall into a lot of mistakes. You can already see that the bishop, knight, and queen here are all attacking this pawn on e4, and it's overloading this square, and white can't defend it with just the queen, and even the knight here on d2, that's only 2 pieces, but this knight is attacking the queen. Black could feel overconfident and actually take with the bishop here on e4, saying, yeah, I'm attacking your queen, so even if you take my queen, I can just take your queen right here. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and black was able to capture this material here on e4. But instead, white can take here on e4, and after the queen takes, the knight takes here on e4. It looks like black came up in the exchange, but then knight to d2, and this is where black loses, because if you start to analyze where does black really go from here, well, if the knight moves, then you can see the bishop's going to just take the rook here on a8. So that's not going to work out well. If they try to defend this, pawn to d5, okay, well, just knight takes here. If the pawn takes, bishop recaptures, and the rook is going to fall. So that's not going to work out well. So at the end of the day, although black does have a ton of material that's actually aimed at the e4 square, the best move now that the queen is under attack is just to retreat. That's exactly what Jeffery does. He understands the threat and correctly moves the queen back to c7. Still putting a lot of pressure on the e4 square, so something that white needs to be aware of, but Jeffery does retreat for the time being. Now, knight to d7. Rook over here to e1, protecting the pawn that we talked about here. G6, preparing to fianchetto to the king side of the board. A4, since you've already castled, start to attack on the queen side. Bishop to G7. Pawn A5, rook to C8, having the queen and the rook on the semi-open file, looking to attack if needed. Pawn takes here. Pawn takes on B6. Knight to D4, really trying to figure out where white goes from here. This knight on D2, it is protecting the pawn on E4, but it's also awkwardly placed because it's blocking in the dark square bishop. Jeffrey's done a good job, besides castling, of getting all the material involved into the game, where white's kind of blocking off both of his bishops. So starts out with knight to D4. That unblocks the bishop here on G2. Queen comes back to B8. Want to make way for the rook to attack. Usually want to be using your queen later in the game, but you want your rook to be the main one attacking the semi-open and open files. Pawn to B3, so opening up if the bishop wants to come either to B2 or A3. Castle on the king side, and then knight to C4. So a couple options that white now has as far as where the dark bishop needs to get involved. So understanding the development that he needs and doing exactly that. Now we see rook to E8, bishop here to A3, knight taking here on E4. So we start to see an attack from Jeffery in the center of the board. Rook takes here on E4, bishop takes, queen takes here on E4, and then knight to C5. And this is also an interesting spot where sometimes I think people could make a mistake and they say, okay, well, I'm just going to go ahead and take with my bishop here on E4. This would actually be a big mistake because the bishop can take here on D4. So after bishop takes, then the pawn recaptures, and all of a sudden this knight is pinned to the queen here on C2. And anytime a piece is pinned down to a more powerful piece like a queen or a king, you always want to attack that. And if you can attack it with a pawn, that is priority numero uno. So that would be exactly what Jeffery would do in this spot. He would play pawn to B5 and the knight would fall. So sometimes that is pretty tricky to think ahead as far as, oh, wow, if I actually take with my bishop, then they can take, and it's going to create that pin here. But being a top-class player, that's exactly what Alejandro looks at, and he correctly takes with his queen here on E4. Knight to C5, attacking the queen. Queen comes back to E3. Knight takes here on B3. And then we have knight coming back here, taking on B3, but that also leaves this knight here on a C4. So lots of exchanging on the board here. Knight now coming here to D4. This is an outpost, but obviously can take with the bishop if Jeffery wants to. Pawn down here to B5. So both solidifying this is an outpost, not generally the piece that you're having an outpost with your pawn. It's usually going to be a bishop or a knight, but either way, it's still protected here on C4. Then we see the bishop come up here to D5, attacking the rook. So the rook comes over here, attacks this bishop here on A3. Bishop comes down B3, attacks the rook. Rook retreats to A6. Knight down to C2. And as we've kind of talked about in the past, once your opponent starts to retreat their knights, that's an opportunity to start to attack. Jeffery starts to push forward with his pawn here on E6. We see the rook swing over here to E6, doubling up the queen and the rook. And then queen to A7 just says, hey, if you want to exchange, that's fine. And this really comes into the end game of what Jeffery feels like he is going to do the best at. And you can see that from white's perspective, he has two minor pieces. And on the other side, in exchange for those two minor pieces, you're really looking at a rook and two pawns. So that feels like a win for Jeffery. So that's why he decided to go ahead and exchange off the queens. Both sides continue to exchange off material. Bishop takes here on D6. Also leaves the pawn here on C3 vulnerable. Bishop takes here on C3. Rook to b1. It's under attack here. Rook to d8, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back. So white does have the bishop pair, but at the end game, 2 rooks together are definitely a powerful, powerful weapon, as well as having the bishop as well. Rook over here to d7, getting them both on this open file in the center of the board. Definitely a good strategy. Knight to a3, and then just comes down b4. Great outpost for the bishop here on c3. Knight to c4, and then rook over here to a7. King to f1, trying to get involved into the game. Once the queens come off the board, a little bit safer to get the kings towards the center of the board. It becomes a very powerful piece in an attack here. Rook down to a1, says, yeah, I'm fine exchanging material here. Bishop takes on a1. King to e2, bishop here to c3. So I would give Jeffery a slight advantage. I do think the rook is a very, very powerful piece in this setup. But it's going to be very difficult for Jeffery to find a victory here. Knight to e5, starting to attack this f7 square at some point. Then we have rook to a8, and then king to d3. And this is the decisive move in the game here, because if we look at this position right here, knight to e5, this is pretty dangerous for white, and Jeffery recognizes some of the threats that he has here, because you always want to look at what's protecting the material. And this knight right here is protected by the bishop on f4. And black can actually play pawn to g5 as a deflection move, and that's going to force this bishop away from protecting the knight. Now, in this specific position, white can just take the pawn on g5. And then it's attacking the rook here on d8. It has to move. So while the knight's no longer protected, the knight's going to be fine because the rook has to move. But Jeffery decided to go ahead and play rook to a8. He saw the potential threat of g5, but he had to get the rook out of the way. But then king to d3 is a massive error. Really, white needed to play knight to d3, probably the only saving move that he has, because after knight to d3, now g5, and in this spot, Alejandro Ramirez decided to resign because there's just no way to continue in this spot. If he plays knight takes on f7, just says, okay, something's going to fall here, then just take the bishop. Maybe the knight comes back, that's fine. Rook to d8, check. But this in-game, Jeffery should easily win. And if the bishop moves, that's fine. Then you're just going to see the bishop take here on e5. So at the end of the day, Jeffery wins. So kudos to him. Unfortunately for him, Wesley So ended up drawing against Nakamura. And so Wesley So is the champion. Definitely needed a loss from Wesley So for a tiebreaker. Thought that would have been truly awesome to see if the teenager could have pulled it out. Now, those two did actually play. That was the only loss that Jeffery had, was playing Wesley So. If he could have drawn that one, then we also would have had a tiebreaker at the very end with those two. But hopefully everyone enjoyed this tournament. Always nice to see people in the U.S. Chess Championship, especially the younger players, do extremely well. Hopefully they can do that at the greater international stage as well. But this is always a fun tournament for me to analyze. Hopefully you enjoyed it as well. Again, thanks for supporting the channel. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Also, would be so kind of you if you hit that like button to let me know that you like the video and the series that we did on the U.S. Chess Championship. But thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.